Hi, I'm Dr. Kerry Gelb, and welcome to Open Your Eyes, your source for everything you want to know about eye care.
AMD really is a condition of the eye, which is the leading cause of blindness in the majority of the developed world. It only occurs when we're older unless you have a genetic defect. The main crux of AMD is really the vision cells. They rust to death. And when you're born, you're given a certain number of retinal cells. As time goes on, due to something called oxidation, a big word I understand, but oxidation is just like a rusty piece of metal. Your retinas rust. And when they rust, they then get very inflamed, which is different than a piece of metal. Inflammation is a natural reaction in the body when things are destroyed. Inflammation is a way to clean up the mess. But if you have chronic inflammation unchecked, then it results in further destruction of the retinal cells. And that, if you lose your retinal cells, you have several million to start out with. And if you lose those retinal cells after 80, 90 years of life, well, that's how you get macular degeneration. So,
Who's at risk?
pretty much anybody who has a family history of macular degeneration is at risk. It is very genetic disease, all right? So it's not passed down like a lot of other genetic diseases like autosomal, whatever, dominant or recessive. It really is a predisposition. Those who are at risk are those who smoke or have smoked for a long period of time. Also, those who are exposed to something called blue light. Blue light is very prevalent in our world. In the past, you used to only get it by going outdoors. The sunlight, the spectrum that comes out of the blue sky, and even the moon or overcast day emits a lot of this wavelength called blue light. Now, blue light, if you're exposed to it a lot, there are two ways that it causes the macular degeneration. The blue light causes oxidation, or it causes rusting. Think of it like spraying salt water on your car, right? Let's say you have a brand new car, right? Well, it's not going to rust that day. What's going to happen is it's going to rust like 10 years from now, and then you'll be driving a clunker, correct? So it behooves you not to spray salt water on your car when you just buy it, right? And that's exactly what blue light is. It's like the salt water for your eyes. It causes rusting of the retinal cells. And so the earlier you're exposed to it, like as a child or as a baby, if you're exposed to blue light excessively with unprotected, then you will have killed off, you will have caused the rusting to start earlier. And that's very bad because if you start earlier, then you'll go blind earlier. So the other source of blue light, unfortunately, comes from our computer screens or your TV screens or your iPhones. This device emits approximately 3 times the amount of blue light that a sunset emits. Now, I go to some nice places. I live in Florida, and so I do enjoy my sunsets. And sunsets are beautiful, but I know in the back of my mind that I should not stare at that sunset. So I give my time maybe 2-3 minutes to look at a sunset, and then I avert my eyes. This device is 3 times the blue light of a sunset. How long do I stare into one of these devices? So as a result, what we're going to be doing right now is we already know that the blue light causes the rusting of the eye. This is like dunking your car into the ocean. You know, how many times, like maybe an hour a day? You know that's not good. Okay. Oh, well, kids sometimes 7 hours a day. Yeah. So imagine like dunking your car, like your brand new, like I don't know, Corvette, whatever, into the Atlantic Ocean, 7 hours a day. What's going to happen to that car? I mean, it's senseless. Now, a lot of us don't think that way, right? Because we don't think ahead. We go, well, we're never going to get old. But the issue is that it catches up to you. We all get old, all right? We all age and we all oxidize and we all rust. So you've got to minimize that rusting. Unfortunately, these devices were never available for our previous generations. So we don't even know the effects of what's going to happen to the whole population that's going to be using these on a daily basis. Think of this like cigarettes. I remember back when I was a much younger person, cigarettes were so prevalent. Everybody had to have a cigarette in their hand. Right now, what do we know about cigarettes? You know, we have to pick our poisons, right? And these screens are as addictive as a cigarette or as sugar. Sugar is another thing that we didn't think much about back in the day until we started putting high fructose corn syrup into all these different foods, all right? And then look at our population of diabetics. And diabetics is the second leading cause of blindness in this world, all right? So we're just really doing a good job for the whole human race. That's all I can say, you know. So nutrition in AMD. I'm a drug developer. That's what I do. I've developed almost all the treatments for macular degeneration that are available, including the injections in the eye for wet macular degeneration. The issue is that nutrition, there are many things that are very, very good for the eyes. But what I focused on was nutrition for the macula, all right? So I worked backwards in terms of nutrition. Just like when we're looking at the teeth, we use fluoride now. I know that's controversial. Fluoride is good, bad, whatever, right? But the reason we realized that fluoride was beneficial for the teeth was because that's what our enamel is made up of. And so it's the building blocks for that. And enamel is the protective coating for our teeth, correct? Same thing with the eyes. What you do is you work backwards. You go, well, what does the eye really need? Okay, so what nutrition does the eye really need? So the eye needs a fuel. The fuel for the eye is vitamin A. Vitamin A is what really is the gasoline so that it will run the engine of vision, okay? But like anything else, we need a protectant. And because it's a very metabolic area, this retina, this back of the eye, especially the macula, which is the center of our vision, which is exposed to so much light, the photoreceptors in our eye have to translate light into vision. And that requires a reagent vitamin A. So vitamin A is very important, but too much vitamin A is like putting rocket fuel into a normal Toyota Prius, for example, right? It's going to destroy the engine if you take too much vitamin A. So I caution people about nutrition and consuming too much vitamin A. Too much vitamin A will burn out your engine and will cause the same deterioration as if you were exposed to a lot of oxidative or blue light. Now, the other area that we need to protect is to have a rust protectant or a factory rust protectant, all right? And it took a long time, but scientists have discovered that the factory rust protection for the macula is this substance called the macular pigment. Now, macular pigment, just think about a tan. If you have a lot of pigment on your skin, well, you're not going to get sunburn, right? You can still get sunburn, right, if you overexpose yourself. But if you have pigment, I can stay out in the sun longer than someone who doesn't have much pigment. And that's just natural. Nature's protectant is pigment. And each part of our bodies, our skin in particular is what we know, has a lot of pigment to protect ourselves from the damaging wavelengths of sunlight, from the blue sky, and other radiations, all right? The eye has something called macular pigment, which is not the same as the pigment in our skin. It's made up of something called carotenoids. Now, carotenoids are not carrots, okay? I know it's a big misconception. Everybody goes, oh, carotenoids, et cetera, so I have to eat lots of carrots. No, they are not carrots. Carotenoids are actually substances that are derived from green leafy vegetables, all right? Spinach, collard greens, kale. And we don't produce these carotenoids. So we have to consume the carotenoids. And if we don't consume the carotenoids, our macula is not protected. So this is actually the most important supplement or nutrition that you can do for your macula in particular, is to consume a lot of green leafy vegetables. There is a little problem, though. Something's happened in terms of our genetic modification of our foodstuffs. In the 50s, to get the appropriate amount of carotenoids, you would probably just have to eat 2 or 3 servings of spinach. The problem with spinach these days and vegetables these days is there's been a de-evolution. So we have chosen seeds of spinach and collard greens and kale to grow very, very fast so that we can harvest them very quickly at the expense of their ability to grab nutrition. So this is the reason why, while I would love to just recommend eating green leafy vegetables and spinach and your eyes will be fine, that's not going to work unless you get seeds from 1953. Okay? Right now, the de-evolution of the nutrition or the supplements or the carotenoids in these green leafy vegetables is in the order of it's 1/21th the amount of nutrition or carotenoids in our current vegetables versus the ones in 1953. So, in essence, to get the appropriate amount to sustain or help the macula protect itself, you have to eat probably around 4 to 5 bushels a day of spinach, all right? Which is a travesty. So that's why we have to use supplements. And that's why I would recommend almost anybody and everybody to use what we call triple carotenoid supplementation to enhance the protection of the macula. MacuHealth is the only one that has the correct ratios. There is an important carotenoid, and it's called mesozeaxanthine, yes. Mesozeaxanthine is what is actually the main substance and main protectant for the very, very center called the fovea of the macula. And this was, I discovered this concept probably in 2008. And this was an answer to a long-standing question that I had been trying to accomplish in research, which was, what was the true macular protectant? And after working with some of the world experts in retina and the eye at Harvard Medical School, we knew that if we could replenish that central macular pigment, we would have a treatment, a preventative therapy for macular degeneration. Now, this is not my idea. I'll claim it to my professors at Harvard Medical School, and they're the ones who postulated this, but until probably around 2002, 2003, we actually didn't know what that central stuff was. And it was not until 2002, 2003 that we realized that this was mesozeaxanthine, lutein, and zeaxanthine. Now, it, of course, takes some time to figure out how to purify mesozeaxanthine, lutein, and get it into a bioavailable form, right? So that's why it was not until maybe 2005, 2006. This was all discovered in the UK. So I'm kind of late to the game here, because I knew that what we were looking for, but the English decided to find it first, and they were the ones that started producing MacuHealth, and they also patented it. So the only way you can get the appropriate amount is through MacuHealth, and in some ways I'm promoting it from that perspective, because that's the only one that has it. which is, that's all you can do. So, and I've now studied MacuHealth for a long period of time. That's at least a decade now. So I started studying it on my patients in 2009, all right? And there's a lot of things that I knew it would be a great preventative. But what I didn't realize, or I hypothesized that if I used it in higher doses, I could make it into a therapeutic. And that's what I've been presenting throughout the world right now in meetings, where I actually use the MacuHealth in high doses 2-3 times a day to prevent the need for something called intraocular injections. That means an eye injection. I'm sure you've heard of eye injections. These eye injections I helped develop and invent back in 1993. And they have really preserved the vision of millions of people around the world. In particular, there is a drug called Avastin. And Avastin is the actual drug that I took from a cancer lab and put it into a model of eyes, which was a model of macular degeneration. And I showed that injection was able to stop the blinding complications of macular degeneration. And now it's been injected in millions and millions of people around the world, saving their vision both for macular degeneration and diabetic retinopathy. Well, what I had postulated back in 1993-94 when I developed these things is I was going to invent a pill that would behave like the eye injections. What I've discovered over the last decade is that pill is MacuHealth. MacuHealth behaves exactly like an eye injection. And I see a lot of patients now, and I was giving a lot of injections. But once I started providing my patients with the MacuHealth alternative, I have more patients that I'm following on MacuHealth than I have getting injections. It's just, it's actually, for business, it's not that good, right? But it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do, all right? A lot of physicians, they will really look down on anything that can replace procedure. So that's why we don't have any treatments for cataracts that are not surgical, all right? And they're not really looking into a pill to replace eye injections because I'm a surgeon, and so as a surgeon, I love to do procedures, right? So why do we need a pill to replace eye injections? That's a kind of a funny question if you think about it, but from a patient's perspective, it's obvious. From a doctor's perspective or a surgeon's perspective, no, right? Because
Dramatic conflict we need.
yeah, it's a dramatic conflict we have. It's not that we need. It's we have this conflict, which makes it difficult because when I speak now, I speak about this more than I speak about the injections, and it's because my colleagues don't like to hear this. They don't want to hear that there is a pill that can actually replace their eye injections or reduce them, correct? And that's common sense. We want to, medicine is all about trying to make previous treatments obsolete. And that's what I do. I try to make all my previous treatments, all my previous inventions obsolete. And if I stop doing that, then I sort of lost purpose, because at the bottom line, you want to help your patients. You want to help human suffering, and that's why we're on Earth. So. Diabetic retinopathy is a simple complication of diabetes, and really, what is diabetes per se? And I'll try to explain it in my terms. Diabetes is just having too much sugar in our blood, all right? Our system is unable to process the sugars and not have it and not have it just sludge up our blood, okay? Now, the way I've explained how diabetic retinopathy works is very simple. What happens when you have let's say, a piece of steak, or like a muscle, like our heart is a muscle, our retina is tissue, and let's say we soak it in a vat of sugar, just a sugar from a local supermarket, and that sugar, you put that piece of steak in the sugar for 20 years, 30 years. What happens is that the proteins in the steak end up getting these sugars attaching itself to the tissue. It's interesting because one of the topics of one of my biotech companies is the understanding of what sugars on the surface of our body, our cells in our body, actually do. The sugars in our body, they signal a lot of different things. They can turn off and turn on various processes in our body, in particular something called inflammation. So what happens if you start putting glucose, which is sugar, onto the surface of our cells in our body? It will change how these cells signal different things in our body. In particular, it will be pro-inflammatory. It will cause the cells in our body to get inflamed. And what that results in a diabetic is, for example, you get in inflammatory areas in the kidney, you get kidney failure. You have an inability to mount an inflammatory response to a wound on your foot, and you get an ulcer that doesn't heal, all right? It really stops our whole homeostatic system, our ability to mount inflammation against like a bacteria or a virus. So a lot of diabetics get sick all the time. It also prevents the wound healing, because we need inflammation that's not impaired by all these inflammatory cells that are mucked up with all the sugar, all right? Now, how does this affect the eye? Well, the eye, diabetic retinopathy is a loss of vision because of several things. The most common finding that we have that causes visual loss is the blood vessels in our eye, they start leaking. And when they start leaking, they develop a blister inside the center of our vision called the macula, and that will make us not see very well. If you have a blister on your hand, who cares? If you have a blister in the center of your vision and you have to see through a blister, not so good. And that's really the leading cause of visual loss in patients with diabetes. The next most common but more profound way of losing vision is that sugar stuff causes the eye to produce something that causes blood vessels to grow inside the eye. These blood vessels aren't supposed to be there. And as a result, they're not going anywhere except into the eye. They carry blood, so when they carry blood and they're not going anywhere, they end up just going into the eye and bleeding into the eye. And if your eye is filled with blood, you're kind of blind. The other problem that happens actually with diabetic retinopathy is that once you bleed a lot, then what does blood do? It clots. It causes a scab to form. Imagine forming a scab inside your eye. And that causes the retina, which is it's an inside lining of our eyeball, to detach. And that's the most blinding complication of diabetic retinopathy. Back in the 70s, my dad invented a surgery called vitrectomy to fix the diabetic retinal detachment. Back in the 70s, he was the highest volume surgeon at Harvard Medical School fixing these things. He would do maybe 40 to 60 cases a week. And so that was the solution to that form of blindness. But like I said, that's a late stage. That's when you go completely blind. And when that happened in the past, before the vitrectomy was done, that would result in the removal of the eyeball. all right? Because if it got scarred down and detached, the eye would shrivel up and it would be devastating. And so you'd have to remove the eyeball because it'd be very painful, it'd be bleedy, you know, it'd be nasty. And so you'd put a glass eyeball, right? But after the surgery was developed, and again, this vitrectomy surgery was really a godsend to millions of people who were going blind from diabetic retinopathy. Then those patients started to lose more of their vision from just the bleeding, not the scarring and the detachment, but from the leaking and the blister formation, all right? So the reason why we have injections for the eye, again, is because when I was, I guess in high school or in college, I never saw my dad. And as a result, I asked him, you know, Dad, why don't I see you enough? And he goes, because I'm doing all this surgery. And I remember him going and sitting me on his lap and going, you know, if you can invent something that will stop these diabetic eyes from bleeding or them from losing their vision, then I wouldn't have to do all this surgery. So as a very young man, I was very motivated to figure this out, you know. And eventually I did figure it out in the laboratory of Dr. Judah Folkman, where I proved in his lab that there is this molecule that was produced or upregulated by high sugars, and also sugars that, remember I told you about the protein? If you have sugars on proteins, it produces something that is called a glucose protein. Glucose proteins actually upregulate a molecule which causes the eye to leak, the eye to bleed, and the eye to scar, all right? So what we had to do was we had to figure out how to block that little factor, and we invented a injection. Actually, I didn't invent the drug, but it was Napoleon Ferraro at a company called Genentech, and I just was the one that used it instead of for cancer for the eye. So now we have treatments, surgical treatments to solve the blinding condition, like the retinal detachment, and we now have injections to prevent that molecule. It's called vascular endothelial growth factor. I know you don't want to hear about that, but I call it VEGF for short, all right? They used to call me the VEGF guy back in Harvard. So, you know, I was the VEGF nerd. And we developed all the different reagents that could block VEGF, and now we use those to treat cancer, as well as diabetic retinopathy, macular degeneration, and other retinal bleeding conditions. What I tell my patients all the time is that if you weren't diabetic, you wouldn't have diabetic eye disease, okay? So it's very basic. You can solve this problem by literally reducing your carbohydrate intake, okay? And that's what I tend to suggest. Unfortunately, if you're already on diabetic medicines, reducing your carbohydrate intake could be very dangerous. So I tend to only describe this on people who are still diet-controlled diabetics or before they have eye disease. And I think this is the biggest public service announcement possible is if you are pre-diabetic or if you have a family history of diabetes, that you really need to control your carbohydrate dietary intake and be that's very, very important. Now, let's say you already have diabetes and you already have diabetic retinopathy. Well, what the sugars do is very similar to what happens in macular degeneration. In macular degeneration, the blue light is what causes the rusting, but sugars are another form of rusting, pro-rusting molecules, all right? So I have been using antioxidants and the macular protectant like the MacuHealth on diabetic patients with pretty good results. But the problem is that that's a very difficult experiment to do because I can't control for how well the diabetic is controlling their sugars, all right? And really, the bottom line is that if you have a poor control of your diabetes, I don't care what I give you, injections, nutritional supplements, you're gonna still lose your vision, right? It's sort of a overwhelming equation, you know. If you have bad control of your diabetes, I don't care what I do, you're likely gonna go blind. I'm sorry, okay? So I have resolved really to helping those who are helping themselves, and then I tell them, because you know, you're doing a good job, and while you're doing a good job, let's temporize here. Use these supplements, use these type of protections for your eye, so that we can eventually get off of them. I'll give you an example. When I give injections to a diabetic, I try to encourage them to control their sugars, because that will reduce their need for a lot more injections. If you can't control your diabetes, those injections become lifelong, right? This is unlike macular degeneration, because once you need injections for macular degeneration, that's lifelong, unless you use something like a MacuHealth to reduce the treatment burden. So, but you know, that's really, in a nutshell, diabetes is a disease that should be controlled by nutrition. It should be. But it's very difficult, and you know, our foodstuffs around, I mean, it's just terrible. We have all this high fructose corn syrup everywhere. We have all these juices and sodas where, like orange juice, for example. Orange juice, we shouldn't be getting that much glucose or fructose. Why? Because we should be eating the orange, which will stop us from consuming so much juice because of the fiber, right? And unfortunately, we're drinking, like, I live in Florida, so we're orange juice capital of the country. You know, we all try to encourage everybody to drink a lot of orange juice, right? But one glass of orange juice is equivalent to like 7 oranges. We could never eat 7 oranges. But that's the amount of fructose that we consume. That's just way too much. That will cause us to become diabetic. And so we really have to watch that. And it's very important. I encourage all physicians and even non-physicians to really watch what they eat. Eat a lot of complex carbohydrates. Try not to eat anything with what we call a high glycemic index. Glycemic indexes means like you eat a food and it's the amount of sugar that will appear in your bloodstream. A lot of foods we're very unfamiliar. Most of my patients are unfamiliar. For example, a carrot has a very high glycemic index, but a lot of my patients say, "Oh, I eat a lot of carrots." And I say, "Well, that's why your sugars are going really bad." I mean, of course, the common ones. You eat a cake, like you eat an apple pie. I mean, gosh darn it, that's going to cause problems. You drink a soda, right? I mean, come on, right? I always implore people not to drink sugared soda, but you know, I don't want to be a hypocrite because you know, I love the taste of soda. What can I do? So I drink diet soda. I know that's not so good for me either, but you know, there's always a interplay between what we call your poisons, right? We're all human. We all have our foibles, and you know, you just have to balance things off. One of my patients gave me a great strategy. He likes to eat things that we're not supposed to eat, right? You know, that are off the list, like a candy bar or ice cream or pizza, right? So what he does is he's an engineer, and he goes, okay, so I know the number of calories I have for a slice of pizza. So what I do is after I eat it, I work out. And I work out just the amount of time required to work off that pizza. Now, if you have the discipline to do that, I don't. Okay, that's probably the smartest and best strategy I've ever heard, but I don't think most people can really accomplish that situation. But in terms of diabetes, nutrition is all about managing your sugars, and then secondarily, if you are in the process of managing your sugars, then using like the triple carotenoid therapy, MacuHealth, and also what's also very helpful is something called omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3 fatty acids are very interesting in many ways. I'll talk about this, I'll try to talk about it in lay terms. The diabetic retinopathy, when you leak and you bleed, it damages the neuronal cells or the retina. The retina is like part of your brain, right? And so think of it like a hurricane, and there's a surge, and then you have a whole place flooded, right? Unfortunately, the Bahamas got hit very hard with Hurricane Dorian, and it leveled the whole place. Well, they can rebuild. So let's say diabetic retinopathy is when you develop a blister, which is like a flood on the macula, and the floodwaters, they damage the retina. So they damage it. If it sits there for too long, it damages it even more. And then you have to condemn the buildings, right? Well, we have reparative mechanisms in our retina to restore certain things in the retinal cells. And retinal cells, neuronal cells, which are brain cells, the main building blocks are called docosahexaenoic acid, which happens to be fish oil. You see? So when I have a diabetic patient or a macular degeneration patient, I try to tell them to take a very high quality docosahexaenoic acid because there are still stem cells that are in the retina. So when it gets damaged, like a storm comes in, you have cleanup crews and you have construction workers inside your eye that are trying to rebuild. But if they don't have the supplies, if they don't have the building blocks, which happens to be omega-3 fatty acids, then they can't rebuild, and you won't get any sight back. So I have my patients who have diabetic retinopathy as well as macular degeneration consume high quality docosahexaenoic acid or fish oils as well.
Thank you for watching Open Your Eyes. Be sure to tune in for more informative episodes.